Hey, thanks for downloading this episode of the Daron Earlewine Podcast. I want to hit you with an opportunity to partner with us this November. You may know Giving Tuesday is a global day of generosity, and this year it happens on November 29th. It's the first Tuesday after Thanksgiving, and this year our nonprofit Blackbird Mission that runs everything we do through the podcast, the book, Spiritual DNA, Pub Theology, all of our ministry is housed under a nonprofit called Blackbird Mission. And this year Blackbird has been given an amazing donation, an unlocking gift of $25,000. So anything we give, anything you give or anyone gives on Giving Tuesday up to $25,000 will be matched. And if we get there, that $25,000 gift will be unlocked. And that will enable us to continue to do the ministry that's reaching you, that's reaching people all over the world through the podcast, Spiritual DNA, the book, Pub Theology, everything that we do as a part of DaronEarlewine.com and Blackbird Mission. And if this podcast has encouraged you, maybe a friend of yours, it's brought value to your life, I'd just love to invite you personally to partner with us on Giving Tuesday and help us expand this mission. So blackbirdmission.com/give is where you can make a donation. Hopefully we're all connected through social media, and we'll be promoting this as we get closer to Giving Tuesday. I really appreciate you considering partnering with us financially to help us continue to expand this mission. Appreciate it. Let's jump into this episode. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Daron Earlewine Podcast. Daron Earlewine, your host. So stoked to have you back in the mix as we go chapter by chapter through my first book, my only book at this point, The Death of a Dream, Resurrecting Purpose When Life Doesn't Go as Planned. And listen, I've loved the first few weeks of this journey with you guys. Stoked to hear you guys getting together in groups and reading it. Thank you for all of those who purchased the book. It means a ton to me. Anybody who's jumped out on Amazon and or Barnes & Noble and left a review for the book to let people know what they can expect when they jump in, what they expect when they read. It means so much. And thanks for those that are reaching out. Please continue to do so. Just email me, Daron@blackbirdmission.com, or you can text me 317-550-5070. Or as always, reach out in the socials, Instagram, Facebook, just search my name. And I'd love to hear from you and what God is doing as you're walking through this process. And we're ready for chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called My Bro Joe. And we get into kind of the parallel story going through the book as we look through the life of Joseph in the Old Testament. And I love the story of Joseph. I've always been drawn to it. It's just an epic story of what it looks like to be a dreamer chasing the dreams of God. And Joseph's story starts interesting, and maybe we should flavor it with the beatitude that started this chapter off in the book. But chapter 5 of Matthew, verse 3, where it says this: "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God in His rule." And that's just true, and it's true of Joseph. It's been true of me, and I wish we were sitting together having a nice cup of coffee because I could hear more of your story of how it's been true about you. Because we talked about it last week, right? So often that micro-sized vision that we have usually is more about our person than about God's purposes. And in that, inevitably, there's a lot of us in it. And I don't know that... I don't think God has to take us necessarily to the end of our rope. I just find as humans, I think we tend to take ourselves there. And it's interesting, Jesus says it in the Beatitudes, right? When you're blessed when you're at the end of your rope, because with less of you, there's more of God and His rule. And humility is something we're going to talk about in this episode. We hinted on it a little bit last week, but it's so important if we're ever going to find ourselves on the other side of this resurrection journey. Because a lack of humility and a presence of a lot of arrogance and pride truly short circuits our ability to actually go through this process, because we stay dependent on ourselves. We stay chained to our bitterness. We stay in captivity to our regret, and we're unable to actually allow there to be more of God and his rule in our life. And Joseph's story is so good, and how it just unpacks this for us. If you get the book, you read through it, we see, right, he has a dream very early on in his life. He's a little arrogant with it. Hey, tells his brothers, hey, I know that, I'm dad's favorite, by the way, had a dream. You guys are going to bow down to me, enjoy, right? I'm in charge. And Joseph's probably, I'm not exactly sure. He's probably, 17, 18 years old. He's a teenager. I don't know, raise your hand if you were unbearable as a 17, 18-year-old person. I know I was. I told a story in the writing of the book that I don't think it's in the book, but I can remember one time I was at a church camp. I was a freshman. So what am I, what are you as a freshman, like 14, something like that? And I was pretty full of myself. And so I was decent at shooting pool. I don't know if I've told you guys a story in the podcast. If I had, sorry, you can delete it. But I'm shooting pool. And it was a deal at this camp, a lot of competition stuff in this camp where you could your team could win by winning different competitions. And so I kept challenging people to shoot pool, and it would be an official challenge. And if you won, I won points for my team. Well, I'm killing everybody, having a good run at it. And at some point in this, beating everyone at pool, I think it would be a good idea to not just beat them, but then try to humiliate them in a way that, maybe a Muhammad Ali would do. So I would beat people in pool, and then I would hold the pool cue over my head, and I would yell, "I am the greatest." Felt pretty good, especially when I was winning. Then one of the senior guys who realized, obviously he realized how annoying I was, thought, I'm going to do the Lord's work here in Daron's life, and I'm going to humiliate him. And so he did. He said, hey, why don't you play me? And I was like, bring it on. I'm the greatest ever is. Champs here. Hello. And he managed to completely run the table. He broke and then sunk every ball in on the table. I never got a chance to hit one ball. And then he lifted his hands above his head with his pool cue and started walking around screaming, I am the greatest. And I can still remember, I can close my eyes and see it. I literally threw my pool cue down and ran out of the gym we were playing. I was a 13-year-old kid. I'm still embarrassed telling you the story. But here's the deal. When we're so wrapped up in ourselves, I don't care if we're shooting pool at church camp or we're chasing down a dream, when it's all about us, we set ourselves up for failure. And for Joseph, he had to as you read in the story in the book of Genesis, you don't see a level of humility really, exuding from his life. And here's what God knew. God knew the purposes that he had created and called Joseph into. He knew the macro story that Joseph and his family were invited into by the Almighty God. And what God knew is there's no chance that the arrogance in this young man will be able to sustain him for the calling I have on his life. And so we come back to, you're blessed when you're at the end of your rope, because with less of you, there's more of God and his rule. Joseph learns his humility in a way that he would not choose. And here's one of the points I want to make is in life, and it's in chapter 2 here. I think, let me see where I say it at. I know it's on page something or other. It's around page 15. But I make this point is that God calls us to humble ourselves. One of the few things that he says, you're going to have to do it for yourself. And here's what I think the choice is for us. We can humble ourselves. That's a choice we make. Or life will humiliate us. It's a guarantee. I've lived this out a ton of times. We see Joseph living this out. You've lived this out. We can humble ourselves, and when we humble ourselves, we receive more grace and presence from God, or we can continue to make ourselves the focal point of our life, and eventually life will humiliate us. And that's what happens to Joseph. And his brothers betray him, right? They sell him into slavery, and this is a tough go for him, and he begins to learn a lot of humbling lessons through his process. Page 11, talking about about Joseph and where he's at in his life before his brothers sell him into slavery. I say it like this. At this point, Joseph was seeing his future from the perspective of his own micro story. He had no idea how his family story fit together into God's bigger story, which was about more than just Joseph's success, his authority, or happiness. This is true. And it's true for you. And here's the deal. The easier part about Joseph's story is we can read it. We read the beginning. We're in the middle of it. We see the ending. We know how it all wraps up. The tough thing about you and me when we're walking this process is we don't know. I don't know how your story ends. I don't know what the greater purpose is that God is serving in your life. And here's one of the difficult things. And I think about, I think it's in Hebrews where it talks about all these believers that had all this great hope and died terrible deaths in the process of not seeing the fulfillment of whatever they thought was going to happen. And I think that's one of the difficult things about faith is this is kind of a trippy thought. Like your journey of trusting what God's doing in your life may never work out great or the way that you think it would. But here's a question for you. Would you live the life God's called you to live, even if you don't love it, if it means that your children or your grandchildren or your great-great-grandchildren would experience the fullness of what God is doing on this earth? Man, I'm just going to be honest with you that I think I still got enough pride left in me that I don't know. I think there's times I think I would tell God, like, I want great things for my grandkids, but I don't really want my life to suck. And when you're at the end of your rope, and that may be where you are right now, these are the kinds of emotions and questions and feelings that it's absolutely okay to argue and to wrestle with God on. And I want to encourage you to do so, because it's in that wrestling that you get to know him and his rule and reign and love in your life. Let's jump back into I want to read a couple more things that are in the chapter here that I think will help you. Here's one of the points that I want you to realize is that humility becomes a pathway to grace and God's presence in your life. In chapter 15, in chapter 2, in page 15 of the book, I say it like this. These reminders in Joseph's story confirm what I have personally experienced. Our most humbling experiences open the door to grace. Not just grace as in forgiveness, but grace that is with us in walking us through the darkest valleys. Humility opens the door to grace, and then grace invites us into a deeper life that moves in harmony with the dreams God has for us and for the world. I want to include, in the small group curriculum, I want to include this kind of grace and presence model that I've created that I think will be helpful to you. Because I remember a friend of mine shared with me a couple years ago when I was in a discipleship group with him, this idea that grace, so often we just hear it as the unearned and an undeserved favor and forgiveness of God, which it is. But he said, grace can also be understood and almost even deeper as presence. The reality that you can't enjoy the presence of God without the grace of God, right? His forgiveness, and through what Jesus did for all of us and through his death and resurrection, his grace invites us into that relationship, but it's his grace that sustains us because it allows us to experience his presence. When we're at the end of our rope, there's less of us and more room for his presence and guidance in our life. And it's really, really true. And so you may be at a place right now where it feels like you've been humiliated. And I'm sure for Joseph, I mean, he's at the bottom of his cistern, then he's in a caravan down to Egypt, and he finds himself, he had to feel so humiliated in that process. How could he tell anybody about this dream that he had, that he would rule whatever, because now he's a slave in Egypt? But what we see in Joseph's life, and what I know that God wants to see in our life, is that he was able to embrace humility as he went through the next steps of his process. And that humility opened him up to more and more of God's presence, over and over again as we see breakthrough in Joseph's life. It says, this happened. This is what happened. Here's what the situation around Joseph. You see him choosing to humbly serve in the opportunities that he was given. And time and time again, it says, and God was with Joseph. His presence was there, and his presence opened the door to God's power to be at work in great ways, to see Joseph step into the next chapter of his purpose for his life. And the same is going to be true about you and about me. Let me share maybe one more paragraph from this chapter, and then we'll close it up. And page 16, towards the end of the chapter, I say this. Maybe like Joseph, you find yourself fighting for a micro dream that's mostly about you. Maybe the waiting is actually preparing you for something much better than you have the capacity to carry right now. And that capacity probably has to do with your character, and mine as well. Maybe your dream is the biggest one you can imagine, but what if that dream is way too small? Trust me, and my bro Joe, it probably is. It probably is, friend, because God's ways are so far above ours. And as we step into this invitation to walk with him through it, it's amazing what doors he opens and where he leads us. I guarantee you, if we could go back in time and interview Joseph at this point in his life and then tell him what was going to be the close of it, he couldn't even have the capacity to conceive of what God was doing in and through his life. And the same is true for you and me. Listen, hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope it's been encouraging to you. And I can't wait to get to the next chapter next week. Before we talk again, remember these three things. God's for you, not against you. He's near you, not far from you. And he's created you on purpose and for a purpose. We'll see you next week right here on the Daron Earlewine Podcast.